Welcome back to Undercurrents from Unheard, where we explore the news and idea that matter beneath the surface. I'm your host, Emily Jashinsky. On today's edition of the show, we are going to be talking about the huge story, the huge battle between Elon Musk and the government of Brazil. This is a huge landmark moment in the global war over quote-unquote disinformation, and we will have all the details coming right up. We're going to talk about some new Trump campaign ads against Kamala Harris. We're going to talk about the Houthis basically seizing control of the Red Sea, and editor James Billow will be here with a deep dive into a huge Russian advance in Ukraine and how that will affect the war of attrition going forward. Speaking of wars, I'm going to be talking about Candace Owens' Cold War history, really our Western ideas of Cold War history, so stay tuned for that. And we're joined by James Pogue. He's a fascinating writer, one of my very favorite writers. He's over at Vanity Fair, Harper's, and has a new New York Times story profiling Senator Chris Murphy. You hear a lot about the realignment on the right, in the conservative movement, and in the Republican Party. But what you don't hear is how the realignment is affecting Democratic Party politics. And James Pogue is here with a fascinating deep dive into all of that. So stay tuned, and please remember to subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Please subscribe here to the Undercurrents channel. It means a lot to us. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please make sure to turn on those notifications for the YouTube channel. We really appreciate it. Now on to today's show. Well, fresh off a jaunt into the wilderness of Montana, we are joined by Unheard Newsroom editor James Billow. James, we have a ton of news to get to today, and in fact, we're starting with a huge story. But before we dive into it, I just want to ask what your impressions of Montana was. I think it was your first time out west.
Montana was the closest thing to God's country I've ever experienced. It was beautiful. I spent 3 days in Yellowstone and managed to not get killed by a bear, so I consider that big progress for a city boy like me.
Well, James, we're starting with this huge story about the feud between Elon Musk, Brazil, X, the fight over disinformation, what constitutes bannable disinformation, what people can do legally, what people should do morally and ethically about disinformation. X is no longer available in Brazil. If you use a VPN to try to access X, you can be subject to fines of like $9,000 a day. So you have a breakdown on what exactly has transpired over the last few days, and this stuff is changing by the minute, but a landmark case, I think, in the global war over disinformation. What the hell is going on?
Well, I think that's a very good way of framing it. This very much is a global war, but the latest example is in Brazil, where the Supreme Court ordered to ban Elon Musk's X for failure to comply with court orders to suspend certain accounts. This has been a long-running battle between Musk and Supreme Court Justice-elect Moraes, and it has finally culminated in this reinstated and rebacked decision to ban Elon Musk's X out of Brazil.
So this is about suspending accounts. That's the sort of meat of the matter?
Exactly, and that's literally all that it is. But the incredible thing is, it's not just Brazil where this kind of thing is happening, but it's justices like Moraes that are very much taking this war to Elon Musk and almost using this sort of quite flimsy reason as justification or pretext to then come after the big company, which he views as a threat to the liberal order or the liberal establishment because of Russ's alleged right-wing turn. It also comes as 3 articles in The Guardian came out last month calling for Elon Musk's arrest for not violating Brazilian laws, but for violating the laws of European countries. Now, what's interesting here is that Europe faces a much bigger free speech problem than the US, and arguably Brazil too. Just last week, the Telegram CEO Pavel Durov was arrested in France for something very similar to what Elon Musk is being found guilty of in Brazil: not complying with requests for content moderation and data disclosure.
Complicity, essentially. It comes down to this idea that if you run a platform that is being abused, you can be accused, the offense can be ratcheted up to arrest level because it is complicity. You're not the person who is encouraging the speech directly. You're not saying, please use my platform to spread lies or whatever. You're just literally operating the platform.
It's difficult to escape the political dimension of this. When Elon Musk was the liberal darling, Tesla CEO, bringing electric cars to the West, there were very few of these kind of threats that were coming through. Now, obviously, he didn't run X. He was much less vocal on Twitter at the time. But since he started pivoting to the right and his explicit endorsement of Trump is testament to that, the liberals, even within the US, have really come after him in quite a big way. And this runs all the way up to Kamala Harris and her vice president, Tim Walz, or running mate, Tim Walz. Let's just remind ourselves, it was a few weeks ago that he told MSNBC that misinformation was not free speech. It would be within the rights of government to start censoring on that basis. So although Musk might be protected by the US Constitution, it's very easy to see how this might slip away from him if there is a Democrat in charge.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. This is going to sound like a crazy comparison, James, but I was looking all over London the last few days for an equivalent of Gatorade. I couldn't find like Gatorade, and some of my friends were having like the European or at least the UK version of different candies, and it just tastes different. And it's because there are different regulations, obviously, in what kind of ingredients can go into food. So it doesn't matter if you make Sour Patch Kids one way in the United States, you have to change them if you want to sell them in the UK or in EU countries. And that sounds like a crazy comparison, but it's apt. If you are running a US free speech platform, you have to comply with regulations that are, by the way, becoming increasingly global. I mean, you see like the World Economic Forum wants global standards for how we police disinformation. So if you want to have a platform that operates one way in the US, or for example, China, where there's not Twitter or Google, you have to comply with different regulations, and it becomes a patchwork. And I think Elon Musk has had trouble in places like India, where he's complied with government requests for censorship demands. That's been reported by Ryan Grimm, among others, and that is a very real problem. But if he wants to genuinely fight against places like Brazil, all for it, because these are not standards that should, these are standards that if you are the United States of America, you should encourage other countries to uphold, because we believe they are good and that they are just and that they create healthier societies. Instead, we have comments from Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, at least in the past. I mean, Kamala Harris's administration was the administration that pressured Mark Zuckerberg, as he discussed just last week in that letter. That is the Biden-Harris administration. Tim Walz in the past has said similarly ridiculous things about how you don't have a right to disinformation. I mean, I guess I'm on Elon Musk's side in this one, even if I don't think he's been the most consistent.
There's a clip circulating on X at the moment which revisits a comment made by Kamala Harris earlier in her first presidential run in 2019, in which she complains about the fact that Musk or people on Twitter have unfettered access to millions of people to just speak freely. And it's as if this concept of speaking to your followers without any kind of censorship line is such an alien concept to the left now. And it's a very strange development to see where this has all gone.
He has lost his privileges and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation. And that has to stop.
Yeah, it's weird. It's totally mainstream. And the Free Press this morning pointed out that some of the free speech organizations, the ACLU, PEN America, at least as of the time they sent their newsletter on Tuesday morning, had not weighed in on what happened to X in Brazil. And again, this is over suspension of accounts. As you pointed out, James, it's easy to get lost and to assume, well, this was, over legitimate propaganda efforts that involved actual bigotry or blah, 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 which is moderated differently in different countries. The US has different standards, obviously, than other places do, which Prince Harry once said, I think he called the First Amendment like bonkers, something like that. It is genuinely different than what happens in other countries. It reminds me of, Julian Assange was charged with the Espionage Act for allegedly helping a source hack into a database. And it's again this idea of just pinning people down with that charge of complicity if they had anything to do with something wrong that someone did in their midst. And it's a great way to nail people when they haven't actually done anything wrong. You just broaden the standards of wrongdoing to include complicity. It's actually fairly terrifying how you have people like Robert Reich, U.S. Clinton administration official, writing in The Guardian that people need to figure out what to do with Elon Musk, and there's not outrage from PEN America and the ACLU. Instead, it seems to be like cheerleading for people like Robert Reich. All right, James, it's after Labor Day now, officially after Labor Day. So we're in the home stretch of the presidential election. We're basically in a statistical tie, slight lead for Harris, but we know that there are problems to correct for in polling, as even Harry Enton of CNN recently reminded people, if we correct for polling errors, we are potentially, that we saw in 16 and 20, we're potentially looking at a race that is totally tied right now. There are some Trump attack ads against Kamala Harris that are well worth digging into, because they will be surely blasted out around the country now that people are really turning on the heat. Both campaigns are really turning on the heat. Outside groups are really turning on the heat because there are literally weeks left to go in this election. So what do we need to know about these ads?
Yes, well, after a relatively sedate summer lull in which Donald Trump did seem to lose some momentum, particularly after the Biden dropout and the Harris ascendancy, he is now taking a much more aggressive line with his opponent on X. And ahead of their debate next week, Donald Trump has been sharing and tweeting a lot of these quite controversial images. So one shows a poster of Muslims burning the US flag with the caption, "Meet your neighbors," while another warns that no one is safe with Kamala's open borders. There's also a final one that runs on a similar theme, claiming that Harris wants to give free healthcare to illegal immigrants. So he's really taking the fight to her, just as Harris seems to be eking out Trump. As you mentioned, we've got to leave a lot of room for errors. There's a lot of Trump tends to underperform in these polls. But just as Harris seems to be eking out Trump in a lot of these battleground states, he's looking to wrest back momentum back in his favor with some of these ads.
Now, I believe Tim Walz, as a policy, actually did support providing healthcare to undocumented migrants. And that gets tricky even with defining the term, because there are a lot of people who were brought in under the course of the Biden administration who were given asylum and were allowed to stay in the country as they processed applications for asylum. So what's actually illegal migrants, undocumented migrants, it's all up in the air. But I mean, that's not a non-mainstream position on the American left at all. I mean, they believe, especially in places like sanctuary cities, that it's a human right. Therefore, if you're here seeking asylum, it should be a human right to get health care. So it's kind of interesting to me, James, how suddenly the Harris-Walz campaign is going to basically turn on a dime against these policies that, especially during the Trump administration, the left was tethered to as a matter of human rights and compassion, and was sort of boastful about. I don't really know how they're going to handle this, to be totally honest. I think, honestly, someone said this recently, like it's sort of in the same way that abortion is for Republicans this cycle. If they're talking about it, they're losing. The more that it's talked about, the worse off they are. This one for Democrats, to me, seems like the more immigration is brought up, the worse off they are. They just shouldn't even be talking about it.
It seems strange how we seem to whittle down these small policy positions. I remember during the Obama-Clinton primary, there was a big discussion about whether undocumented migrants should be getting driver's licenses. And it never really seems to evolve much from that. And again, this was a big talking point in the West Wing, the TV program. So it's just this recurring theme that seems to happen after every single Democratic presidential primary or a presidential cycle. The difference being is that with Harris, it's much harder to figure out what her policy position is on this. And that applies to her whole suite of policy proposals. We still haven't really heard much from her on foreign policy, what her position is on Ukraine, which we'll get to in a bit. But it's very difficult to get a grip on it, especially when there's so little time left in the race and how little she's actually featured in front of the press.
Yeah, again, I think it's just worth emphasizing that this is basically, even though I think it's rooted in bad motivations, has been so far a genius campaign strategy by the Democrats, because you switch out the candidate at the last moment to somebody who doesn't do interviews, gets a lot of great press because people were so desperate for an option other than Biden, and is wishy-washy, so you can't quite pin her down. The question, I think, from today until the election is whether that overconfidence or whether that disinterest in whether that risk aversion, let's put it that way, becomes counterproductive, becomes something that starts to really irritate voters, avoiding interviews in the press, flip-flopping or being very vague about where you actually stand. Does that start to irritate voters more than, it gives them an excuse to support the Democratic ticket this time around? I think that's frankly the question going forward, because it gets to whether the sugar high is able to be sustained through November, because the sugar high isn't defined by how long it stays, right? Maybe this high is relative. Maybe it lasts months. Maybe it lasts, when we look back, 6 weeks from when she first took the ticket, but it will all be over after Labor Day, which is, we're talking the day after Labor Day. So that seems to me to be the question. I don't know how much longer she can get away with it. It's possible to me that she is able to sustain this level of vagueness until Election Day, but I can also see people starting to get extremely frustrated with it, especially after the debate, if she performs poorly.
Right, but it's also fair to say that this is a common strategy for any frontrunner. I mean, Trump, during the Republican primary debates, he obviously didn't participate in those because he was just so far ahead. And in the immediate aftermath of that Biden debate, he was uncharacteristically silent for a couple of weeks because, as that old Napoleonic saying goes, don't interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. So clearly Harris still thinks that her campaign has the momentum and that any kind of interview could risk any kind of gaffe or invitation here. And that's why Trump has also really ramped up his media appearances. Later on today, he'll be publishing an interview with Lex Fridman, one of the prominent podcast hosts in the online world. So it'll be interesting to see what he publishes there. But you can really see the dichotomy between the frontrunners who feel like they don't need to be doing too much press and those who are really looking to wrest control of the race back in their favor, and how much they tend to do too.
That's a good point, actually, James, about the Trump. Even I remember in 2016, a lot of people probably remember, he said, under my healthcare plan, everyone will have coverage, and sort of avoided committing to specifics on a policy level, which politicians had often felt compelled to do and would be pushed to do by the media. So I wonder, in some sense, and I'm just thinking aloud here, if Kamala Harris is benefiting from the post-Trump political order by not being pressed to get more specific in a weird way. It's sort of like she's benefiting from this new standard set by Donald Trump. That doesn't say politicians, of course, they've always been wishy-washy and vague and all of that, but it does seem to be a new level of brazenness, I don't know, with the Harris campaign. These immigration ads, we'll have to see if they dent her numbers, because they've been really, those numbers compared to Biden and even just on their own have been great, even in Sunbelt states, places like Arizona, places like Georgia, North Carolina, way ahead of where Democrats expected that they would be. And you can see immigration being one thing in particular that would puncture the bubble, the sugar high, if these ads, that I'm sure the Trump campaign has very specific plans along those lines for ads like these. James, this next story is the definition of an undercurrent story, like even in a literal sense, not even just the metaphor of an undercurrent story. The Houthis control the Red Sea. And this has been true for a while, true in some sense for a while, but is especially true now, but is being totally buried for some reason in the press. It's a very busy news cycle, but the reality in the Red Sea right now is absolutely massive. So talk to us about what's happened recently in this region.
I mean, there's almost a story in the fact there has been no story, because it's been a few months since we heard about the Houthi blockade in the Red Sea, and you'd be led to believe that you think that it was all over. Well, actually, today the blockade appears to be stronger than ever, and the American military has essentially given up on trying to lift it. So just a fortnight ago, the Houthis managed to board a Greek-flagged oil tanker. It planted some explosives, and there were chants of death to America, death to Israel, as the vessel went up in flames. Now, that is just one example of the many disruptions still occurring in the Red Sea, and it is having an immaterial impact. So let's look at some supply chain data. Disruptions can actually be good for shipping firms because rising freight rates drive profitability. So according to new figures from shipping expert John McCown, industry profits almost doubled from Q1 in 2024 to Q2 in that same year. So this marks a huge failure by the US Navy to restore orders to that area.
A lot of people are looking at this and wondering, how is it? Like, as you were describing what happened yesterday when the Houthis managed the Greek oil tanker, the Greek flag on it. A lot of people are wondering, so how, right? How? Why is this happening? Because surely the countries like the United States have the might to prevent the Houthis from taking over a Greek flag tanker. So what's going on?
Interesting, there are parallels here with the Ukraine conflict as well. It costs a lot more to defend than it does to attack. These Houthi drones cost negligible amounts of money, but the US is having to spend huge amounts, exorbitant amounts on bombs to actually try and prevent them from happening, but also to try and secure the area. And again, you're seeing the parallel thing happen with Russia and its glide bombs and its relatively low costs ammunition compared to the Patriot missile systems and all the weaponry that is being used to defend Ukraine. And so there's a huge disparity in the cost of defense and the cost of offense. And the US Navy is really struggling to manage that.
Why is it the US Navy's responsibility to secure these shipping routes in the Red Sea? Now, a lot of people who followed naval issues know the answer to that. Very obviously, it's one of the big sort of talking points of the US military. But just on that most basic level, for people wondering, why is this the US responsibility?
Fundamentally, Joe Biden sees it as a key way of securing his own legacy.
I forgot Joe Biden was the president until you just said that, James.
Well, believe it or not, he is still in charge. I don't know how much he knows about what's going on, but he did try to cobble together a European alliance and got a very lukewarm response. There were some countries that were interested in supporting, but some, and it was actually very much replicative of the Iraq war alliance, with France expressing reservations, but UK being a lot more gung-ho about it. So obviously, America has the resources and the deep military might and wants to express itself as the global leader and the global policeman. And once again, Europe has sort of half followed along. But one country that has been affected and really hasn't shown much interest whatsoever is China. And they've kept largely out of the conflict as they have with Israel and Palestine. And they're basically letting the whole thing unfold for itself. So it's very much on the US's shoulders.
Yeah, very much allowing the US to be undermined on the world stage in a massive way, and a super interesting connection, by the way, between nationalism, patriotism in the US and actual pocketbook issues, and that sort of peace through strength formulation that Ronald Reagan obviously popularized in the minds of a lot of especially like boomer voters, and I think for good reason. You are going to be poorer as the United States of America. The sort of less powerful, respected, trusted your military is for reasons like this. I mean, it's just the inflation numbers, I think put that in sharp relief, James. All right, James, you've prepared a deep dive on the Russian advance in Ukraine, particularly in Donetsk, where we've been talking recently about Ukraine's incursion into Russia's territory, but Russia is advancing in Ukraine. So what's happening as we get into this later months of the year? We're almost into the fall. I guess we are technically into the fall and almost to the end of the year, frankly.
Yes, well, for the last 2 years, the Ukraine-Russia conflict has essentially devolved into a war of attrition. But this is a very significant advance made by the Russians into Donetsk, one of Ukraine's easternmost regions, towards the key logistics hub of Prokhovsk. The UK's defense ministry said that the Russian forces were now 10 kilometers within this key logistics hub, and the coverage of the takeover is actually slowly filtering through into the mainstream press too. Now, it's difficult to understate the gravity of this offensive if it does pull off. Some analysts think that if Prokrovsk falls, the entire Ukrainian front line in the Donbass will start to collapse. There was one Ukrainian military expert who told the BBC that if we lose it, the entire front line will crumble. So this is getting all the way up to the BBC now.
I'm really not hearing much about it though, James. I mean, it's like, as you say, it gets all the way up to the BBC, but once again, we're in the middle of a presidential election. One of the candidates is part of the administration that has been prosecuting the entire war as a major funder, and we're not even talking about it. I mean, I've seen so little, at least in the States, so little coverage of what happened.
We've heard very little from Joe Biden. We've heard very little from his administration, even though that this pivotal town, which lies at the heart of a network of roads that spread in all directions.
Sorry to interrupt again, but what's the significance of Pokrovsk? Because basically nobody in the West is going to be familiar with Pokrovsk, but it is a very significant area.
Yeah, so Pokrovsk lies at the heart of a network of roads that's basically spread out in all directions together with a key railway station. So if they lost this transport artery, it would make it impossible to resupply troops across the defensive line in the Donbass. Now, that is where the center of all this fighting has been taking place, even all the way back to 2014. So if they do lose this town, then that is going to be hugely strategically important. And since each point of the line relies on another, a collapse in a few key nodes could cause the whole thing to crumble. And it's all part of a much more general advance by the Russian army over the past few weeks. So Newsweek reports that Moscow captured 93 square miles of territory in August, which is 5 times higher than the 21 square mile average its army took in the first 7 months of this year. So although we spent a lot of time talking about Kursk and that surprise incursion into Russia and how much the Western media gave attention to that, that was essentially designed to force back Moscow, to pull back troops from the Donbass front line, which seems to have failed. In fact, if anything, Russia has doubled down on that, and it looks as though the momentum could be shifting back in Vladimir Putin's favor.
Yeah, so what does that do for this war of attrition? I mean, that's the big question looming over all of this, is that we are now closing in on 3 years of what's become a war of attrition. So how could this potentially, we hear about it all the time, all of these small developments could be the pendulum swing, they could be the momentum shift, and of course they always could be, but so far the momentum really hasn't shifted. So what does this do potentially for Putin in the weeks ahead?
Right, so fundamentally, the army in Donbass now risk being encircled, which could cut off a whole section of the Ukrainian army. We do talk about, okay, this could be it, this could be the next moment, this is where it all could transform, and I hasten to add that we don't know that, obviously, but we are seeing signs in the US that they are clearly quite worried about this, because just this morning, it was announced that they would be willing to send long-range missiles that would launch deep into Russian territory as a sort of response to what's going on here. So there does seem to be a tacit acknowledgement about how important, how vital this one particular part of Donetsk is. And so whether Joe Biden commits to that decision, we don't know yet, but it seems to be escalating in a very big way.
It's so interesting and so completely undercovered. James, thank you so much for bringing us these stories today.
Thank you.
And we will be back with more Undercurrents, talking a little Cold War history. Of course, what's more timely in the middle of a busy news cycle than pausing to think about Cold War history? I promise it's very relevant. We're talking about Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and the history of the Cold War right after this. Well, there's been a lot of sneering and mockery of Candace Owens bouncing around the internet lately, including from me, to be honest. And again, to be honest, most of it's deserved. I do, though, think it's extremely worth understanding what's happening beneath the surface, if you will pardon my undercurrents pun. That is, of course, our motto here. Now, Tucker Carlson is currently taking tons of heat for interviewing Daryl Cooper on his show this week, with a lot of that discussion centered on the Cold War, the immediate aftermath of World War II. And I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but I'll say one thing it shows is that we're in the midst of a long overdue reckoning. We were lied to about the Cold War. We are being lied to about the Cold War still today. And basically from the end of World War II to now, we have been lied to about the Cold War. We are literally learning significant details about American malfeasance during this conflict on an annual basis. Because the Cold War occurred in the 20th century, that means we have infinite volumes of written evidence along with audio and video to sift through. And then we have to put all of those pieces together as new documents are declassified or discovered. Plus, so much of the history, think about the Kennedy assassination, remains classified and undiscovered. But Owens is one of many people who are reacting to this hidden history by reflexively categorizing the West and the US government as bad overall, because in some of these individual cases, well, it really was. New details did not stop emerging after the Church Committee era, and some modern corruption has precedent in that era as well. Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, which Owens has cited, really did deepen our understanding of MKUltra and the FBI and the CIA and the Beach Boys for some reason. That book came out very recently, very recently. There's also Devil's Chessboard, among many, many other reports and tomes released just in the last decade. We probably wouldn't name an airport Dulles today or the FBI building after J. Edgar Hoover. That's how significant the vibe shift has been, thanks in part to the right, and this includes me, conceding in some cases that people like Noam Chomsky kind of made some good points about U.S. foreign policy. With the benefit of hindsight and declassification, it's sort of easier to make those judgments. I wasn't alive in the 1980s, but I bet I'd have been more willing to believe arming, say, the Contras was necessary if I was born in a world without nuclear weapons, then suddenly thrust into a new chapter of human existence where Soviet influence in our hemisphere posed this new, strange existential threat that we weren't used to as a species. And the same goes for the Soviets who were dealing with our nukes, by the way. Journalists like Stan Evans actually dug into newly declassified files like the Venona papers that were released in 1995. Think about that, 1995, and found pretty incredible evidence that Soviet agents genuinely did infiltrate the US government when we were teetered at the brink of nuclear catastrophe. You don't have to get into the full history of McCarthyism to understand that. We're still teetering now at the brink of nuclear catastrophe, though we prefer not to think about it. We need to be clear-eyed and honest about our history. It's almost like someone who's not guilty lying about their alibi. You still don't trust them. So when new generations of Americans, like me, like Candace Owens, frankly, start hearing completely true facts about insane measures the CIA and the FBI took to stave off nuclear conflict, it's really easy to reflexively side with the people giving you that information, who tend to be categorically anti-American and anti-Western, which, by the way, is fine for them, but often involves its own revisionist history that whitewashes Soviet evils and downplays Western accomplishments. We see this starting to come from Candace Owens, for example, and treating people like they're stupid for being upset about, in many cases, true information from great journalists like O'Neill is wildly unproductive. We generally act as though the Cold War somehow proved the human species won't be destroyed by nuclear weapons because we've lasted, less than a century? Less than a lifetime? A blink of an eye in the scope of our history? It's really dangerous to lie about how we handled these threats in their earliest years of existence because we're still in the earliest years of their existence. As with all, quote, disinformation policing, it drives many people towards worse information. And it's also just untrue. Being honest about how the US reacted after World War II isn't the same as siding with the Soviets, turning into Angela Davis, or agreeing we're the bad guys. But being dishonest will push more and more people into those positions. We'll be back with a fascinating interview with James Pogue right after this. I'm so excited to be joined now by one of my very favorite writers, James Pogue, who is a contributing editor at Harper's. He writes about national politics over at Vanity Fair, and he has a book called Chosen Country. Definitely recommend everyone check that out. James, first of all, thank you for being here.
Of course. I always like talking to you.
You had a really fascinating profile of all people, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut in the New York Times recently. And Chris Murphy, the reason this profile is so interesting, and I'm excited to sort of talk to you about your experience, he was considered for a long time like a very normie Democrat, which is basically exactly what you would expect from the state of Connecticut. And I just want to start by asking you how your rapport, how your, I guess, journalistic relationship with Chris Murphy started, because from what I've heard, that's actually kind of an interesting story in and of itself.
Yeah, I get nervous because I don't like to sound self-aggrandizing in this, but I mean, we talked on a different show, I suppose, about my new Right piece that came out in the last few years for Vanity Fair. And again, not to like puff my thing up, but like to point to the larger conversations that I think are bubbling up throughout mainstream society where people actually want to be having these conversations and haven't been allowed to. That piece spoke to a kind of like, as people say, describing the water to the fish, like the sort of describing the structures of liberalism and neoliberalism to people who have just sort of lived with them forever and have been feeling that something was off, right? And so Murphy read the piece and then reached out to me and was like, can we talk in private and just sort of go over this and talk about what kind of politics it might lead to. And so then when we had this kind of like long off the record conversation where I recommended him all these books that I'd been on this trip forever because I grew up like an anarchist and like a weirdo. And so, you know, these like ideas of like David Graeber or, I love Jim C. Scott, who just died, who, critiques the entire idea of state formation. And then, of course, a book that probably you've referenced and talked about a lot, Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. And Murphy started reading this and had this whole like transformation into this kind of guy who was engaging with heterodox spaces that, unheard readers are probably quite familiar with, but like mainstream normie Connecticut senators are not. He calls it a journey. So that stuff is real.
It's so interesting because a lot of people will point to, in New Right circles, will point to this piece that you're talking about that you wrote years ago now and say, this is really the only piece that's ever gotten it right about what's happening in these circles. It's the only piece that's ever been fair and appropriately nuanced. And even people, who have critiques of the project but are a part of the project. And so that Chris Murphy, it caught his attention and he wanted to sort of sincerely engage with this question of frankly, to quote Deneen, why liberalism failed is really fascinating. And James, if you could just talk to us a little bit about, in your reporting, where this has led. Normie Democrat Chris Murphy, long known for being a kind of pro-business, pro-gun control guy from Connecticut. Where's he going now that he's on this journey?
Well, I think the fundamental problem is, okay, so you've concluded that liberalism failed, or some version of liberalism failed, or at least you're open to that question. And then the sort of obvious follow-up question is, what do you do and how do you jettison liberalism? And that's actually not where the normie Democrats who have entered this conversation are headed. So, and I don't say that it's a criticism. So I quoted Ben Rhodes in the piece, and I talked to Ben Rhodes for 3.5 hours because he's like wrestling. These guys are really, really wrestling with this issue of like, okay, these are real economic, political, financial, and military superstructures that uphold the neoliberal system. It's not just a worldview. It's not just like, oh, corporations don't have tax cuts. Like, or, you know, it's not, that's not where this is going. This is the financial plumbing of the world system that we're talking about. And so if you want to really critique it, you are risking systemic earthquakes. And so what is really, I think, on fire right now on the center left, in spaces like the Hewlett Foundation, you know, there's this whole, like, people on the new right will call it, you know, the realignment industrial complex with some cynicism, but there's a kind of race to try to figure out how do you reform this thing without blowing it up, right? And so that's a quote from Ben Rhodes in the piece. When I saw Chris on the floor at the DNC a couple days later, he was like, yes, that Ben quote got to the heart of the issue. That is what we're wrestling with. That is a really uncomfortable position for Democrats to be in, because they have found themselves now in the position of being the defenders of the institutions of neoliberalism, even as they feel like they're supposed to be the ones unpicking it.
Right, and you know, I can maybe name like Ro Khanna, and there are other people, there's a handful, you can count them on one hand, of elected Democrats. That's not to say there are all kinds of Republicans taking brave stances that force them to empathize with Democrats, because there aren't. But since we're talking about the left right now, there aren't many. And so I guess, you know, James, what's your sense of how optimistic Murphy is that other people are going to come along on this journey with him? Because if anything, what we see among a lot of people on the center left is, and you referenced this, kind of a digging in of the heels, like the Hillary Clinton, you know, the people with the highest, what should she say, the highest GDP in each state. Those are the states that I won. You know, that's a lot of what we hear from people like that. So is Murphy having success if he's trying to persuade others to come along with him?
Well, so there's two ways of looking at what success would mean, I think. And way one would be, can you convince people at a high level in the Democratic Party that let's start with the spiritual thing, because that's the core of the issue. There's some kind of spiritual metaphysical crisis in this thing where, even though supposedly we live in the most materially wealthy society in the history of the world, like 70% of the people involved in living in this place don't like it and think that the whole thing should be blown up. Obviously, something has gone wrong there. Democrats in general are not willing to admit that. I think at a higher level, in, you know, like when you look at the people who, those of us who are inside of this baseball game, you know, we know these names. It's the Ro Khannas, it's the Jake Sullivans, it's the people like that. Those people, I think, have increasingly come around to, okay, this is not working, right? Then you have this bigger question of like, can you sell it to a Democratic Party where a lot of the time when they hear spiritual crisis or like unpicking neoliberalism, what they mean is like white guys want to be back in charge and do class politics or whatever it is, right? Or in the particular case of Murphy, who believes that if you want to really tackle corporate power in America, which is where he thinks the spiritual crisis derives from, then you have to assemble a 60% majority and really start hitting reset buttons, really start building a New Deal style coalition to, ironically, kind of unmake the New Deal order that we have. So that gets complicated. But like, in order to build a 60% coalition, you have to reach out to social conservatives. And as everybody who listens to this knows, there's a huge portion of the Democratic Party that just has absolutely no interest in that, right?
And vice versa, too.
And vice versa, right? As a matter of fact, a lot of the people they want to reach out to are just like, are you kidding me? The Democratic Party? So like the part of it is that I'm chatting right now with an ex-Kamala staffer who just left to go do state level stuff, and I will say though, I mean, this guy, I don't even want to reveal his age because I don't want to get him in trouble or make him identifiable. But this guy, I posed to him what I just said about there being a fundamental problem with the defense of institutions and people not acknowledging the spiritual crisis. And this is a guy who literally worked for Kamala, and he immediately wrote back and he was like, yes, that's the core issue. That's the core issue, not just of democratic politics, but of world politics at this moment, I think.
Well, so here's the big question, that we were flirting with in this conversation about unmaking the New Deal. How does this manifest on a policy level? So if Chris Murphy can build a coalition, somebody like J.D. Vance, then Ro Khanna, maybe Thomas Massie, if we're taking House and Senate people, and maybe a president who would sign a bill like this, what kind of policies could actually, A, address the problem, and then B, have enough consensus to start changing the country?
Well, so the actual problem is that the Bannon-Vance analysis of this is deeply, deeply bound up with unmaking the military-industrial complex, and they believe very strongly that you actually can't do this if essentially America underwrites the security of the globe, number one, and number two, the dollar remains the reserve currency and artificially inflated forever. And that the Fed continues to make our greatest export financial products and dollars printed by the Fed, which it starts to get into a really, really complicated conversation, which I would love to have. The Democrats, and so a Ro Khanna vision, and Ro has thought about this. Ro's vision is you spend your way through it. So industrial, if he would argue that the returns on industrial investments are high enough that even though we're in spiraling debt, the only way we do it is we spend our way through it, right? And so at a super high level, what you are talking about is basically inflating our way out of consumer debt. We're basically, your credit card debt goes away because we just inflate it to hell. And our federal debt does the same thing. There are versions of this that are really high level statecraft kind of games to play that could end up bringing this thing down to a soft landing. And the thing that you'll hear, I think, that I've come around to, and that I think you'll hear everybody really say, is that what we're lacking is a real presidential vision, a real top-level presidential vision that could explain how serious the problem is and how bad the choice we're facing right now between trying to bring it down to a soft landing and having this blow up really is. And so Ro talks about that in the piece. He's great leaders tell stories that fit into the cultural and religious context of nations. Biden tinkering with tariffs and industrial policy was I'm sure Ro would think is great, but it's not telling America a story of how we get past this trap.
I was actually just going to bring that up because that sounds New Deal-esque, and Biden and John Meacham actually collaborated on making his two signature pieces of legislation, which was I think it was called the American Restoration Act, and then there was the CHIPS and Science Act, feel like a New Deal to the American people. Now, obviously, they weren't as comprehensive as the full New Deal package in retrospect, and we can look back on it. But CHIPS lost the support of people like Marco Rubio at the end of the day, and this is going to sound very wonky, but it's actually pretty interesting, over some questions about China, over some questions about subsidies, and it gets down to this level where Rubio and some others, it just fell apart because of some of these, I guess I would call them cultural questions, culture war questions. It just didn't work.
This was really interesting to print in the pages of the New York Times, but Ro Khanna was a co-author of the CHIPS Act. And he said to me, you know what we should have done? We should have opened a steel plant in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And we should have led off with that because that would have showed we were listening. And what he's implicitly saying, actually, I'm speaking for him, but it's obvious what he's implicitly saying. He's saying we needed to speak to white people. We need to speak to white people and say, look, we actually do care. We're bringing you along on this project. The vision of the world we Democrats want to make is a multiracial democracy that is heading in a new direction. It is not some restored American 50s greatness that the other guys want to do. But in order to get there, we've got to bring you white guys along too. And we're willing to make it clear that we're trying to do that. That was Ro saying that. That is a Democrat saying that. And he was the author of the CHIPS Act. So the cultural stuff is very, very core to it. And I think he's quite aware of the problem.
That is absolutely fascinating, and I think could also apply to like Black auto workers in Detroit, the types of people who Nina Turner said just last week are feeling, quote, emasculated. That's a quote she gave to the Free Press by the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of room, I think, even for cultural consensus in ways that I guess Chris Murphy, Normie Democrat, is joining Roe and others in being well aware of. And that's kind of the big question for me, James, is what did it for Chris Murphy? I know you were talking about some of the books that you passed along and these conversations that you were having with him, but in the eyes of so many people like Chris Murphy, there is a very real caricature, because it's been fed to everyone by elite media, honestly, of who is in the so-called new right. You were talking about how everyone in the new right is, quote, weird now, and there are a whole lot of weirdos in the new right. Don't get me wrong. But all that is to say, what convinced him that, A, these people had a point, B, that the people they're trying to represent are worthy of empathy, I guess, and not just sort of bitter, clinging racists?
The word he used to me was ideas energy gap. He perceived an ideas energy gap between what was happening on the new right and what was happening on the left. I mean, he used the word the left, and I think, there are certain leftists who would sort of look askance at hearing that Chris Murphy considers himself to be a part of the left, But, speaking for the left as a broad tent, I really actually think that was it's just completely true. Like, I think, for me, when I wrote that piece, I was like, I had an intuitive sense of, like, let's say the spiritual crisis. I had an intuitive sense of, like, oh, there's like a crisis of productive ability in this country. Like, because as you'll know, like, I spend all my time sort of like in these like rural areas where everybody feels like super disempowered, and there's all these like weird issues about land, and like nobody can like productively use land in America anymore. And I've always been obsessed with this. So you sense that there's a problem, but then you discover like, oh wait, actually there's a set of people who actually have a theory and are interesting and have serious conversations about this. Where else are you going to go? Once you've had that sort of, as Mr. Yarvin would say, red pill, like, where do you go, right? And for Murphy in this time, it sort of worked out that all of a sudden there were these people, associated with American Affairs, associated with Compact, associated with the Hewlett Foundation, where like you could go and not be new right. You could go and be heterodox or center left, or and there's a lot of money flowing to these things all of a sudden. There's a lot of there are real think tanks that are coming out of these things. All of a sudden these conversations are things that people at very high levels, donor levels, are people are interested in having. So for someone like Chris, it was sort of just a moment of opportunity where if he had started feeling this way 5 years ago, he's either out of the Senate or he's a complete wingnut, right? But right now the moment is bubbling up, I think.
Yeah, just a final thought on that is it's kind of interesting too, because that relies on the right, sort of center-right people in these heterodox spaces creating a soft landing pad too, and credit to Sohrab Ahmari, like understanding what kind of environment a Chris Murphy needs to, see deeper into an issue. I don't mean that in a condescending way, but we all have our own sort of blinders on. And so to understand how to help people think through these things differently is no easy task. And I think people like Oren Cass and Sohrab have genuinely done a pretty good job of that, even though they take a lot of flack from the right.
I think that's very true. I mean, I think what we are witnessing, and what may be a real boon for the people trying to push this stuff from the center left, what we are witnessing is that in the post-Elon era takeover of Twitter, as the right has now been given license to have like the most extreme takes be the stuff that gets the most traction, and to sort of spin into these purity cycles and spin into these cycles of audience capture and all of that stuff, a lot of the actual kind of like heterodox, open-minded, let's hear from everybody and talk to everybody and be friends with everybody, a lot of that energy is actually now coming from, I don't know if you want to call it the left, but like whatever that kind of middle ground space is, that middle ground center left social democracy kind of like thing that Sohrab is trying to build back, and like super, super inside baseball, but one of the great internet dramas of the last couple of years has been the exile of Sohrab from the right. And I think it's in part driven by the media systems. And this may sound like it's far afield, but actually it was those same media systems before that allowed these things to be so heterodox and interesting on the right. And now I think they're sort of suffering from the same problems the left had of like groupthink and lockstep politics and that sort of thing.
100%. The gatekeeping. Yeah, the gatekeeping becomes back in vogue. Great point. And my last question for you, James, is you have this like brilliant idea to call Garrison Keillor and ask about Tim Walz. And you wrote about this for Vanity Fair. Just for the audience, what did Garrison Keillor have to say about Tim Walz? And is there a kind of realignment lens to any of that either?
The best bit of it, or the bit of it that really hit on, what was on display at the DNC, which you obviously saw, was this kind of like attempt to recapture normalcy, but more than that, Americana and patriotism as these sort of like capital D Democratic Party values, right? And I will be candid, that's a project I'm highly cynical about, because I think that if you want to do that, you actually need to meaningfully address the questions that someone like Chris Murphy is raising about globalization and financialization and things that actually screwed over rural America, right?
You can't just put an LL Bean jacket on and dress up. Yeah, 100%.
Exactly. But so Keillor, the first thing he said is that he still goes around the country and he still sings, every show, when he does a show, he sings in the dark with the audience, "My country, 'tis of thee." And he says it's very moving. And he says that in general, younger people tend not to know the words, which is, sort of goes to the point of a lot of what we're talking about here, right? And he had a maybe like, I guess you could say, a pretty normie lib take on this moment. But, the idea that the first step is wearing the camo hat. The first step is messaging. And, this is kind of what Ro Khanna is saying. This is kind of what Chris Murphy is saying. The first step is messaging that we'll sing "My country, 'tis of thee." The first step is putting on the camo hat and actually like, okay, look, we are speaking to a broader cultural middle that like we all know. And Keillor said this himself. He was like that, it's become too academic. It's become too cut off. This is what we've lost our way with talking to America. I was a little surprised to hear Keillor use the first person, or this, the plural phrasing of that, in the sense of like, it's like, okay, man, Garrison, okay, you're a we, like a capital D Democrat. And it turned out he had done fundraisers for Waltz, So he's very, very invested in this project. So which surprised me. It was interesting. I wouldn't have thought. But he's, part of that sort of, I guess you would say, Minnesota Democratic establishment. But he still saw the problem. And then I'll close this long answer by saying that one of the things I mentioned to Keillor, and that I have seen in reporting on NATO and other stuff like now that I've gotten into geopolitics, is this is something that's going to have to happen across the world, or you're just going to lose. And so you'll look at the British Labour Party, and obviously Unheard covers this better than anybody, but like, you look at the British Labour Party and they're out there singing "God Save the King." They're out there waving not just the Union Jack, but the flag of St. George. Right. And they are making it really clear. And that, there was an Irish guy, I forget his name, an Irish consultant who got together with the Starmer Brain Trust and was like, you're going to have to do this stuff. And so, circling back to how we started this, okay, fine. Once you've built that consensus, once you've conveyed that you can do the camo hat or the flag of St. George, can you actually start to unpick neoliberalism in a meaningful way? And no, the short answer is none of these people have serious proposals for how to do that yet, because they've concentrated so much on convincing people at a high level that this is a project worth taking on. Now we're going to have to see step two.
James, this show has been airing for a little over a month, and that means I've done like a dozen interviews or whatever. This is my favorite so far. So thank you so much for taking the time. This is fantastic.
I really appreciate it. It's great talking to you as always.
Of course. James Pogue, make sure to obviously read this latest profile, follow all of James's work. James, we'll see you again soon.
Cool. Thanks. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's edition of Undercurrents. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience. We are here every Tuesday and Thursday and appreciate you tuning in. We'll see you here soon.